Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of the Lodgge podcast, brought to you by Interactive Ontario with support from Ontario Creates. I am your host, Scott Milley, and I am honored to welcome our next guest, the uniquely talented Astrid Rosemarin. Astrid, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Astrid is a communications director at New World Interactive in Montreal, Canada. She has over 10 years of experience in communications and community management in the video game industry, and has worked with some of the best indies that Ontario has to offer. Today, we're going to talk about Astrid's career, the vital role that comms and community management plays in the industry today, and plenty more. So, without further ado, let's get into the conversation. All right, so Astrid, I kind of wanted to open this up with just more of a lighthearted question, kind of get ourselves into the spirit of things going on right now. So right now, as the holiday season, it's a time of getting together with your friends and with your family. The last couple of years aside, and the plague aside, what is one of your favorite traditions that you always look forward to this time of year that is you feel is a little more unique to your family and friends?
That's a good question. Probably. So Christmas and Hanukkah and all of that stuff, it changes a little bit year to year because my husband's family is in BC and my family's mostly in Toronto. And so we kind of depends where you go. But when we're at my family's house, we do this nice breakfast. And it's just like, I don't know, it's nice. It's nice to have cheese and sausages and baguette and stuff like that. Champagne. It's just a nice little tradition we do.
That's awesome. Our family is the same way. Like I always love having that like breakfast, like Christmas breakfast, or like right around that time of year whenever we all can to get together with having so many different families all over the place. It's the way things are now. But yeah, it's like one of my favorite times of year. I absolutely love it. I was able to, in my last place, I got to decorate a little bit more. I just moved in here a couple days ago, so I haven't got there yet. Just the Pokemon badges.
I never decorate, but living in the Old Port in Montreal, they have all these like light installments everywhere. And so the city decorates for me. So I don't have to do
Just
all
look
that.
outside.
Yeah, it's
Perfect.
lovely.
All right. So let's get into a little bit of your career because I know that's why a lot of people are here. And that's, I think I told you that when we had our first meeting, saying that like when I first got into the industry in Ontario, you were actually one of the first people I followed.
Which
Just
is
because
ridiculous. I'm
I,
just going
I had seen you interact with certain people that I had followed and I really liked. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. So I followed you, found out that you actually worked at Interactive Ontario a long time before I did in a different
yeah.
era for IO. So I thought that was going to be one of the cool things I'd be able to talk about. What was one of the things that has kept you still so close with Lucy and the organization? And like, why do you think you've kept that relationship so strong over the last 10 years?
Honestly, that one's tricky. I was definitely part of my formative years in that I worked at the New Media Business Alliance before IO was IO for when I was like still in university, and it was a summer job. And then I went to work at IO a few years later after my stint at the Bell Fund. And and I think I had this pretty unique role where I spent a lot of time working with the board of directors, where Lucy was at the time. And I got this really great insight into how once you get to a higher level in the industry, you can have real impact on what's going on. And so I don't know, it was pretty inspiring as a young, plucky Astrid. And I loved all the events that we used to run, and we'll get back there eventually. And it's just, I really became, I used to do student government stuff when I was in university. And I've always kind of been a big believer in institutions and their power to potentially change things for the better. And I think a trade association that works really well has a lot of potential, especially for the membership, but also just for the industry as a whole. So I don't know. I've just always loved IO for a million different reasons. And then when Lucy took it over, we always had a good relationship anyway. And so we just kind of kept it up. We go for lunches when we're in the same city. It's lovely.
What a time to be alive.
Yeah.
I've met all my coworkers once,
Well,
just being in different cities, right? And not having like a central office.
Yeah.
But like you were saying is that like in university you did a little more like with politics. So like your major was in political science and economics.
Yeah.
Now you are a communications director in the video game industry. Can you
Yeah.
explain a little bit of how one got to the other?
So I wanted to do economics, and then I got to university and realized that I didn't have the math for modern day economics. I really liked the more philosophical side of it. And so then I dropped to a double major instead of major minor. And then I got what's it called? The throat thing. Anyway, I got mono.
There
And
it is. Okay.
I got mono, and I failed stats because I wasn't well enough to take the exam, and I couldn't get an exemption. And so I failed stats, and then I had a decision to make. Do I take an extra class either over the summer, which usually I went back from Kingston to Toronto, and so I was like, do I really want to do that? Or spend a whole extra semester or year at university, which I really didn't want to do either. And so then I flipped to a politics major minor, very specifically because of statistics, which is fine. And then when I was finishing fourth year, so small context that my mom works in the television industry in Toronto, in Ontario. And so she caught wind of an opening at the Bell Fund to fill in for someone on maternity leave. And it was just like a low-level coordinator job. And so I took some time off from university to go do that interview, or maybe it was during one of the breaks or something. So I interviewed with them when I was visiting back in Toronto, and I got that job. Hopefully there was no nepotism involved, but so I got that job. And then I moved. So yeah, essentially I finished my classes and then I started immediately. I actually left university early to go start working at the Bell Fund. And I did that for a full year while the person who was there was on maternity leave. And then when I finished at the Bell Fund, the person was coming back, so I had to find a new job. And then this position was open at Interactive Ontario. And I also happened to know the people who were running Interactive Ontario at the time, because the person who hired me actually worked at my mom's old TV studio. The industry is very small.
Yep.
And so I went there, and obviously I still had the skills to do what I was doing, but for sure connections were part of all of this. And it was the same group of people from when I was there doing my little summer job as the New Media Business Alliance. This is very convoluted. So then Interactive Ontario was essentially my first foray properly into the video game industry. The Bell Fund is all about combining digital media and interactive media with television studios. So it was more on the TV side.
Yeah.
And then at IO, we had a games sort of subcommittee, but we also had an e-learning subcommittee and for other interactive sectors. So I got this big like smorgasbord of what we now call IDM. And then I just stuck around in the games industry after that. Once I moved to Montreal, which was more for personal reasons, the games industry is huge here. So it's really easy to just sort of email around and get connected and build a career here.
That's something we'll actually speak to more like in a bit, is exactly that kind of relationship with Quebec and like the video game industry that they have, and kind of the community that they've managed to build over the last 20, 30 years. Mm-hmm. But that's actually one thing that I did want to bring up, as you were saying, it is so much about like connections and like meeting people and knowing people and kind of that that back and forth that goes along with it. So people that are coming into the industry for the first time, like I know for myself at least, I wasn't one of those people that was super comfortable, adding every single person on LinkedIn if we had never met, and I wasn't, making all the phone calls, and it was really hard for me to kind of have that. I was very lucky the way I got into the industry, and I think now it's a completely different story. But what do you think are some of the tips that you could give to people that are either looking to change careers into the industry or are, you know, going to school and looking to break in that might not be as comfortable as people that, you know, go to a party like or an event and able to talk to 100 people in a day?
So I think that people assume by networking they or we mean going to a party, drinking a bunch of booze and hanging out with people and having a good time. And then, like, 6 months later, someone is like, oh, I need a graphic designer. And I met so and so at that party and I'll find if they're available. Like, that's the traditional kind of concept of what people mean by go do networking, and that for sure works. I know tons of people who find success that way,
Oh.
like myself included. um, but it's not just that, especially nowadays. There's dozens probably of industry related Discord servers that you can, like Interactive Ontario has a Discord server that you can hang out in. And there's digital networking that can happen in things like that. Twitter, love it or hate it, there's a ton of people in the industry on Twitter who are chatting away with each other. You don't have to know them in real life for that. But also, there's this in between where there's both digital and real life events where they need volunteers, they need people checking the door, taking tickets, showing people around. And so there's a lot of opportunity to help out. And yes, it's volunteer work, but you're spending your days meeting people, and that's all you're doing. Like, you have this task, and then everything else you're doing is just meeting people. If you're a super internal looking person and you really don't feel comfortable talking to people, the problem is you're going to have to, in the industry also, pretty much all of game development is based on collaboration and teamwork. And so if you don't feel comfortable talking to people enough to meet new people, just to build networks, like, and connections and friendships, you might actually just struggle in the job as well. Some jobs are more isolated than others for sure, but even the the most isolated concept artist, so and so, whoever, they have to collaborate with the other artists taking their concepts and turning them into assets, and everybody else involved. If you're like on a game that's licensed, your concept art is being dealt with the licensor. Like, there's all kinds of jobs that people think are for introverts, but you still have to do a lot of collaboration. So I don't know. It's
I
a
think
thing.
kind of speaks to it is like the last episode we actually had Erica Evans from Phantom Compass, who is incredible and one of my favorite people in the world. But she was talking about getting into production and saying that like one of the first things she did was go and talk to every person individually and just to kind of get a sense of, you know, their concerns, the things that they enjoyed, just being, I think, being more of a people person. I don't think you need to be like this social butterfly, right? Like I'm actually like pretty introverted. Like I enjoy this job and I really like being able to meet people, especially at like hosting a podcast and like doing these kind of things. But I think it's in a position like that I'm comfortable with going to a party with a bunch of people I don't know, or going to an event with a bunch of people that I don't know with no real like touching point. I think can be a lot more difficult. That's why I think I love being in the industry, because no matter who I meet, there's always a similarity. There's always something to connect with people with. So I think as long as you have that passion and you kind of come in as like a genuine person, you will find people. People will be drawn to that if you're a real human being.
And the thing that everyone needs to keep in mind is with networking events, everyone's there to meet people. That's
Yeah.
why they went there. If they didn't want to meet people, they would have stayed back at the hotel, or they would have gone to a lot of the private dinners that happen around events and conferences. Like, people go to networking events to do networking. And so it's totally fine to just like walk up to a random person. And what I always just do is like, oh, so why are you here? And 9 times out of 10, it works out. Sometimes you get someone who's just like, oh, I work in games. It's like, that's nice. So do we all. Like,
That's why we're all here.
but in general, it all kind of works out. Having a wing person is for sure helpful. And so if you have one human being to hang out with and to start with, and then you all can branch out, that's super helpful. I am happy to be any of your wing people persons anytime if you see me at an event. I'm slightly awkward, but that's okay. It works. It's fine. We're all awkward a little bit.
I think that's also a major thing too, is that the people that you're talking to are probably you have a lot more in common with than you realize.
Yeah.
So it becomes a lot less intimidating when you actually start to meet a bunch of people in the industry and you're like, oh, okay, we're all a little like this, like, which is really endearing and like I really enjoy. Like I feel much more comfortable going into a lot of situations because there is that like touchstone between people now.
Yeah.
So you went to like a ton of different conferences, obviously, and like I know you've been to E3, which is like on my bucket list. That's like the number one thing I want to do. That's one of the reasons I got into the industry, was to go to it was one thing, be a part of it was something I never imagined, but is now definitely a major goal. Is going to conferences something that you miss the networking part of it? Like, are you more of one of those people that like going to the talks and like learning, or are you like, hey, let's just finish this up, go get some great food and like meet people now? Like, are you more comfortable with networking, and do you miss that?
Yes, I miss it desperately for sure. I so my big blessing that I got from Interactive Ontario was that we ran so many conferences. By the time I finished working there, I had seen enough talks that I realized that for the disciplines I'm interested in, marketing, communications, social media, things like that, nobody shares anything that's like radically game changing at a conference. They're sharing their success story, which by the time it gets to the conference circuit, probably isn't going to work for anyone else. Or you have to be creative enough to take that nugget of inspiration and turn it into something totally different. So, especially if you're newer, you're probably you're probably not even empowered enough where you're working to be allowed to do that. And so it's just like I haven't been to talks in years. Like I just don't go. There's a couple very specific things that I've done, like leadership conferences and very specific discoverability things or sessions like that. But overall, I just don't anymore. And it's not even because I know everything, because I really don't. It's more that like you learn so much more by talking to people you know in the industry and they tell you stuff secretly rather than at a conference. That's very specific to, in my opinion, communications and marketing. You can learn basic things like what a press kit looks like, a good one, and what best practices there are and things like that. For me at this point in my career, it's just like I'm not going to learn anything radically new or different at a conference talk, but I will meet all the people who I cannot meet online. Like right
Got
now,
it.
I am having a hell of a time trying to find someone from Facebook to talk to in or Meta or whatever it's currently called in that sphere.
A whole
But
different conversation. Yeah.
the thing is like if we had GDC in real life still,
Mhm.
Facebook usually has a booth there, and I could go and I could say, Facebook people, I need business suite access for my community manager. And I cannot do that online. It just, they don't have points of contact in that way. So there's these things that you don't really think about, but they're all tied to this conference cycle, whatever it is. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, but that's how the industry currently works. And so there
So
we
from
go.
like your first conference to like the last one you went to, like you went in with completely like or taking completely different things away from it. Being like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
learning so much, but like I think meeting the people has always kind of probably stayed the same. Um,
Yeah, it's always meeting people, networking, and my general philosophy with an event like GDC or these big sort of multi-day events where there's too much to do for any one person is every day I have my one main goal and then everything else is gravy. And if you just spend time planning out your event, essentially, you can really like maximize how much you do for yourself there.
That was another thing actually that I wanted to bring up with you, is you were saying that something that you managed to, like, you learned obviously early on, but is something that you kept going back to, was actually dealing with communities. And obviously we've talked about dealing with people and networking and things like that. But on the business side of things and the developer side of things, you've gone into community management and you keep coming back around to it. Do
Yeah.
you think like that you're actually learning, that you've learned certain skills in community management that you've taken over to comms that someone who stayed specifically in comms doesn't actually have, like those particular lessons learned?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think community is, and maybe this is partly informed because I started as community manager kind of position, but to me, it's the core of your player base is your community. And at the same time, it is the expansion of your potential player base. There are people who, in the olden days, we used to talk about transmedia a lot. And you look at a game like League of Legends, and they have fashion related to League of Legends, and they have Arcane on Netflix right now.
So good.
That's essentially what a solid transmedia property looks like. They have a K-pop band. So you can have fans in your community who don't play your game because they like the clothes, or they like the K-pop band, or they like watching Arcane. And so the your community can be impossibly large, but at the same time, you're super fans. And it's everything all mixed together. So for me, it's this concept of, if you target your communications strategy to being able to tackle that, talking to your core players, but also anyone who could be interested in your IP as a whole, then traditional comms, so targeting media, is not as important, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's very, very, very hard to get media coverage and you can't plan it at all. Like, they have their own priorities of the media outlets. And so you can never plan to have media coverage. So don't even do that. Target your communication strategy more on the players, have them be the center of your show, and then you're kind of good to go. I think that's my logic anyway.
I mean, that's fair though. Like that makes sense, because you don't, like you've brought it up a couple times, like you can't really count on like traditional media as much as people think that you usually could in the video game industry, just because like they do have their mandates and certain things that they need to cover. I think like certain places you can probably count on maybe getting a review or getting something. But it's, if you're not one of those big companies or one of the things that you know is going to get a lot of traction. But there are like the success stories, right? Of like the big con from like the Mighty Yell that just came out this year. Like they did really well with that stuff, seeing them all over IGN and all the kind of coverage that they had. But I wonder if do you think that speaks to, obviously there's the inherent skill involved and there's a lot of like their outreach and that communications is at a very high level, but do you think it also speaks to the game itself and they know that it's going to hit a certain niche? Like what do you think like is most important in that?
It always comes down to the content. And so an outlet like IGN, you have a different news editor than a reviews editor. So for example, and same with the video side of the site. So if you have an amazing trailer, you send that to the news editor and they love it or they don't love it, and they decide if it goes on the site. If you want to do a preview, so a look at the game before launch, that's not a review, that's a different editor. And he will either love it or not love it, or he'll have some other games in the pipeline that we don't know about because there's a surprise drop from someone or whatever.
Yep.
And especially nowadays where everyone's online, you have things like, Nintendo will announce a direct a week in advance. And any indie would have already chosen their launch date, say for the same day, and they can't move. So this gigantic like company is just landing on their heads essentially. And and that is more newsworthy. And so like IGN will write about the Nintendo Direct before you have a little indie game. The big thing though is scheduling exists. And so if you can get your amazing content out to the outlets really early and they love it and they want to run something, then they can still do that and prep all the content and schedule it to go for whenever you set the embargo date. The big thing though is I find with all game developers, it's not even just indies, is devs want to work on something until they can't work on it anymore. And so they don't give outlets enough time to do stuff. And then more often than not, they'll say, this would be great if we had had it like 2 weeks ago, but we don't have time to work on it now. And so then they just don't do anything. So, add these buffers into your timeline. I think it's important.
That also kind of speaks to like just comms in general in the industry, is that it's very peaks and valleys, right? Where it's like, okay, like there's only so much that you're able to do. And then when you get it all, you're trying to get it done as good and as fast as possible so that you can get it into everybody's hands as quickly as possible. So that turnover isn't, too long. So yeah, I think that's like a unique thing for the video game industry that I think a lot of people don't realize. I think it's like just the constant cycle of things, right?
Yeah. And there's also, to me, one of the biggest things that no one talks about is just content fit. You have IGN and GameSpot, which cover all the big things, but then almost every other site or outlet or influencer or content creator has a specific bent to them. And so I remember pitching an outlet really early when I was at Evolve, and it was like an action game that had some RPG elements, a bit of character leveling and progression. And the editor wrote back and was just like, we're a hardcore RPG site. And so this is not even like, never do this again. And I never emailed them again unless I had a really proper RPG
for them.
But it's I don't know. I think a lot of people don't understand who they are emailing, and often they don't have the time or take the time to understand that. And so they just blast out their announcement, whatever it is. And 90% of the people on that list probably just don't care because it's not in their wheelhouse.
Because the only way to really, like, you and me actually started talking about it pre-show, but it's the only way to really get anyone's attention is by focusing in on a specific niche. Like, it's truly is, if you're trying to please everyone, you're literally going to please absolutely nobody. You need to find that one thing that makes you unique, just like in life. And then people will be drawn to that. That's what people will be like sought after. So you're saying with a company like that, that's like, we only do hardcore RPGs. It's because people look to them specifically for that and value them for that.
Yeah, and that site, they're called Vextra Life, and you go onto that site or the YouTube channel and you see RPGs that are not being covered other places. So if you're really big into that genre, you go to that site instead of IGN or GameSpot because they just cover more of it. And then there are sites for MMOs, there are sites for action games, like there's all of these different outlets out there. And quite honestly, a smaller site cannot compete with IGN or GameSpot or those big websites. And so they don't. Most of them just don't even try. They do their own thing and they find success where they can find it. And that's good, like good for them. And it's a tough, games journalism is like a very tough sector to be in. But they need to make it work for them. And part of that means we need to work with them to the best of our ability.
I think that was my original goal when I decided to go into the industry, was games journalism. And then I kind of like took a step back and like looked at what I really wanted to do and what I wanted to get out of it. And I was like, I'd love to work with games journalists and like, sure, do some writing on my own. But that is a career just felt like I wasn't going to get everything that I wanted out of it, because you're not writing all the things you want to be writing. You're not, right? Like, you're exactly like you're saying, like, yeah, certain companies are like, okay, these are what are going to get the clicks. But even like the people that are writing for them are like, oh, I would love to write about this weird indie game. Oh, I'd love to write about like this great studio that no one really knows about yet. And it's like, yeah, but that's not what's going to bring in the volume. That's not going to bring in the clicks. So you kind of have to do that because it is a business. It's the biggest business in the world, and like that does have a trickle down effect to all of the employees across like every discipline.
Yeah, like there are multiple game journalists that I follow online and who I've talked to before who are on the Fortnite beat in the same way that you have a city reporter at the local, they're on the town hall beat or whatever. It's like games like Fortnite are so huge and they take up so much space on the outlets that they employ full-time or almost full-time staff. Compare that with your indie game where you're hoping to get 1 or 2 articles, period, or a review. It's just a challenge to get that kind of coverage. So ultimately, I think you don't try for media coverage. Try and get reviews because those are important for business as well. Try and get previews. Like, put the minimal effort in to secure as much as you can, but don't make it a cornerstone of your communications plan. That's my humble opinion anyway.
I think that's good advice though. And I think you probably like, do you think you learned a lot of that going into Evolve? And like, because Evolve was the first time that you were working on a bunch of different projects at once, right? Everything else was a little more. So obviously, there's a few things going on wherever you are, but I mean, like as a PR firm, like you were actually working with a ton of different studios on different projects, different communities, and working directly with influencers, which I think is something we haven't brought up yet. Is that the thing with those really big media companies is that they're hitting the certain things that are going to get the clicks, which has kind of given a rise to influencers, which is no longer a new thing, is no longer a buzz thing. It's been going on for a long time, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's just getting more and more complicated. So you working directly with influencers, how did that differ in like obviously the most basic of ways than working with like big media? Like what did you learn from that when you first started working at Evolve, working directly with them?
So the neat thing about Evolve, which is different from some other PR agencies, there's some that do this and some who don't, where we treated content creators in a similar way to media. So we said, so if your job was PR specialist, I don't know why I did that. That was our title. I was a PR specialist.
I was like, that was your real title. Yeah.
I wasn't a specialist. I was just called a specialist. But if you're a PR specialist, you were not doing only media. You were doing media plus content creators. There are some agencies where if you're PR, you're just media and that's it. And then they have separate roles called influencer management or, whatever, relationships, whatever they want to call it. So because we were dealing with both, you start to see the similarities and the differences for sure. Honestly, the biggest similarity really is just that everybody, media and content creators, their email inboxes are so overwhelmed by how many games and announcements and newses there are. Almost no one replies to emails. Like that's the big similarity. Ultimately, every game is different, and so your plan is different for everybody. There's some basic things that are always similar, like getting codes out for reviews or trying to do something interesting around E3 or Gamescom or PAX or any of those bigger consumer-facing events. But ultimately, it comes down to, can the game produce content, trailers, screenshots, GIFs, whatever that is? Can the game be shown off at all, or do we have to keep everything secret? What's the timeline looking like? How concrete is that timeline, or is it going to get bumped multiple times? There's a game that will remain nameless, but
Good call.
there's a game that I helped out a little bit on at Evolve, and it's launching now-ish. And it originally was supposed to launch like over a year and a half ago or something like that. And so it's like you can announce something and you can say it's coming, and then it's not because more work has to be done. And so it's a challenge. And content creators versus media need different things from the game. So if it's not ready to be hands on, what is a YouTuber going to do if they can't physically play the game?
Yeah, fair point.
What is a Twitch streamer going to do if they can't play the game on stream? Like that's what they do. And so if your game is not ready for that, what are you going to do with them? Not much.
Yeah, they can't really do a lot of like advertising, or they can't write
Yeah.
articles, anything, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so media outlets, they can write articles based on a screenshot. You can God, I mean, they can write articles based on a tweet if they wanted to, and so
It happens
there's a lot
all the
more.
time.
Yeah, there's just more leeway there, you know?
Oh, that makes sense though. I think like getting into that side of the industry is something that like I've always been curious of and always wanted to do. Because like creating content's one thing, which like I do enjoy doing. I don't stream, but I think a lot of people, especially on the fringe of the industry, don't realize how hard that job actually is. Like, can you imagine being on for 8 hours, or like that being your full time job is being on camera all the time? Is
I could never be a content creator.
no, I have like 3 cups of coffee for an hour long podcast. Like, I don't
Yeah,
understand how people are like, that's what they do for a living. And it's incredibly important and
yeah.
valuable, I think. Brings a totally different angle to the industry now.
Yeah.
But is that something that like you enjoy doing differently? Like, obviously you were just explaining the kind of differences between the two and how to handle them. Did you enjoy working with influencers more than media, or was it something that was just like a new unique challenge or something that you got to work on?
So to me, they are all the same conceptually. They're all human beings. So like I
Sure.
enjoy working with human beings and it's great. And I really think about I go super big picture when I'm thinking about how to market video games. And so I kind of just think about where each type of person slots into the plan or the grand master plan. And so it's things like how do you want to announce the game? Do you want to do it at an event, or do you want to do it in partnership with someone, or do you want to do it by yourself or in a showcase,
Mhm.
or like look at Apex Legends and they just had 300 streamers drop the entire game all in one moment, you know?
That was smart though. I thought that was
It
a
was,
good decision. They even spoke out about it after. Like, yeah.
it was super amazing. Um Obviously most like games can't afford to do that
No.
kind of development and then launch, but it was incredible. And so I think if you think about all the different big things you have to do for your title, announcing the game, previewing the game, allowing people to actually have hands on time before launch, launching, reviews, post launch content, it's the whoever you're dealing with, content creators, media, but also other stakeholders, business partners, they all have their kind of part to play in this little activity, I suppose. And so it's just a matter of figuring out who can be most appropriate where, I think.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense though, because you're trying to like. I'm also a pretty like big picture person. You kind of have to like zoom out, and you have like your Gantt charts, and you have like your
I
whole
hate
plan.
carrots.
So do I. So do I. But like, it was just something that's been ingrained in my brain long ago, and it's still use it. But yeah, so like that makes a lot of sense to me though, that you're kind of like putting them in the same vein, because I've always thought of them as something completely separate of like how you would handle media or how you would handle content. But like you were saying, you just need to know who can like who can use what essentially.
Yeah, to me, it's really like so there's media who are impartial. They're not invested in you or your game at all. They exist, and their job is to report on things or share news on things, or it's all fuzzy, sort of what is in every single outlet. But ultimately, they're sharing information for the sake of their readers, and that's it. And then you have your community who only care about what's going on with your IP in the game, around the game, whatever it is. And the experience of being in and around your sort of ecosystem. And then you have content creators who bridge that gap. Some content creators are like supercharged community members, and they only make content about your one game or group of games, and they're super dedicated to the ecosystem you've been building. They are part of the community, but with megaphones essentially. And then some content creators are closer to media, and they're sharing just the latest hit game or the games they enjoy. And it's less about being part of a community, more about reporting on whatever's happening with the industry. And so it's like, again, it depends on content fit. Everyone's different. Every outlet's different. Every content creator is different. And it comes down to research. And this is why these agencies exist, right? There's so much grunt work of researching and identifying and keeping up with movements. And it's like too much work for one person to do, really, especially if they're doing other things as well. And that's the benefit to them.
I think that's something we always speak to as well, like especially on this podcast, but like just talking about Ontario in general. Like we have by far the most like micro studios in Canada. So it's something that you have someone that's doing your PR and your, you know, your comms and community management. A lot of times that's one person, or they're doing those things plus other things. Are there a couple of little like overall tips that you would give someone that's doing that? Obviously you can't do all of those things to the master level, right? Like no matter what, but are there a couple like basic things that you would like check boxes that people could use if that's who they are at their specific studio?
I think there's like little hacks that people can do, but ultimately I think it comes down to taking a really hard look at your game and your plans and your ideal situation, and really focusing in on the core of that. So for a lot of indies, it is essentially have a solid Twitter presence, because on Twitter you have game journalists, you have influencers, you have like players in general, and other industry people. And so with one tweet that goes viral, you're hitting all the cross section of everyone in the industry. And it's not everybody, but it's small people, like groups of people from all those areas. If you're on Facebook, that's essentially only players that you're going to be talking to. If you're on LinkedIn, it's pretty much only industry people you're talking to. And then I would, depending on your game and your ability to create content, we can sort of start to put TikTok in there with Twitter. But I'm not entirely sure. It's probably still more player focused, maybe influencer focused. Instagram, totally like influencer focused. It's not really, you're not going to hit a lot of people from the industry, like the developer side of the industry.
Yeah, of course.
So for a lot of devs, it means Twitter, which again, you can love it or hate it, but that's how it is. I think that usually it is worth it to do media pushes for things like review season, or when it's time to get your game reviewed. Big announcements like your game announcement or big trailer or something like that is usually good for coverage. And then it really depends if you have a demo, maybe send that to influencers and try and get them to play it on their streams or their YouTube channels. It really depends on the game and the content and what you're doing. But the biggest question comes down to how much capacity do you have? If you are a writer, then you're going to want to focus on Twitter anyway, because you're writing posts for the most part. You might have a GIF or screenshot, but it's a lot of writing. If you're super into video making, maybe TikTok or Instagram is your answer, because then you have a bit more creative freedom in that way. Um, it depends on what you're actually physically able to do as well.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So like I think Twitter has always been the one that I've definitely used the most and the one that where you
Oh, Lewis
meet the
list.
most people. Yeah. There and I think it's I wouldn't say necessarily the easiest, but like you were saying, like if you're a writer or something that you like enjoy doing, I think you can kind of like schedule out certain things and get information out there very clearly and quickly with 2 sentences rather than cutting together a video that's a minute long that'll say the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is with the video game industry is that it is very, very visual. So being able to have that screenshot, and that's one thing that they'll always tell you with Twitter too, is like if you have a GIF or an image or something like that, or a small video, your engagement is going to go way up. It's
Yeah.
just something that people are able to engage with. But I think for me, it's been industry wise, right? Like me not actually working at a video game studio, industry wise, Twitter has by far been the most helpful when it comes to meeting
Yeah.
people, getting to know people, and kind of learning people's interests, what's hot, what's not, what's going on, what's the conversation. I think is a major part of being in the industry at all, whether it's happening in your side of the industry and like your genre, or it's like just the conversation. I think you need to know, especially in comms. I know you know this very well. You need to
Yeah.
know the conversation, whether it's directly impacting you or not, because it probably either does or will at some way, shape, or form. You need to be aware.
Yeah, it's funny because there's a lot of chatter about how there's the discourse and whether or not
Game dev
it's
discourse.
good to participate in it or not. But the thing is, and the thing that a lot of people don't understand about people in my kind of role, our kind of role, is that regardless of our comfort level in participating in it, we should be aware of it because each of those topics represent an opportunity for us as a studio to stumble in a similar kind of problem or not, or take advantage of positive things that are going on, especially if we're already doing that, or we can do that, or it's in line with our company values. Then it's like it helps identify certain things. But ultimately, it's if a studio is getting flamed for something that's inappropriate or bad that's happening, it gives us a chance to reflect and on our studio and if that's happening here and that needs to be changed, or if maybe it, a lot of times inaccessibility or accessibility options go viral on Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
and all of those are learning opportunities for someone like me who doesn't really use very many accessibility options. I can take all that back to the studio and double check that these are being considered or not or whatever. And it's the, as harmful as it can be, it can also be really beneficial. But it's only beneficial if you make it so. And so
Mm-hmm.
you have to actually action on all these things.
You actually have to know what's going on. That's a really good call, actually, with the accessibility features. Because I remember, like when, like I'm the same thing. Like I don't have to use a lot of them, but I remember when The Last of Us 2 came out, and that
Yeah.
was like massive. And like I played it, and I went through them all, and was like blown away. And I was like, I can't believe how far they went with that. And like much more recently with Forza Horizon 5. And it's like, okay, obviously smaller studios aren't going to be able to implement every single one of these, but what are a couple that people are really talking about and people have found a lot of value in that you would be able to implement into your game, and hopefully it becomes the norm, right? And that becomes okay. Clearly, these are the ones that are speaking to people.
Yeah.
I think even one with, I believe it's Halo. I don't want to be misquoted on that, but that you're able to change just the outline of the enemy. Instead of it being red, you're able to change it to any color that you choose, rather than saying, okay, we'll switch it to this color, switch it to that. It's like you just choose whatever works for you. And that
Yeah.
seems like such an easy fix that like most people wouldn't, like I never even thought about it. And it's like, why can't you just choose your own color? Again, it's obviously a lot harder on the game dev side of things than people realize. It's not as easy as flipping a switch, but it's still an interesting thing to know and see.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, every feature comes down to priorities. And so if something becomes the issue, even for a small amount of time, but it makes a lot of sense for any studio looking at that discussion, that makes it possible to raise in the priority list. And so it's like, I don't know, I think all of us chattering away and sharing information, I think it's really helpful. And when we do it on Twitter, it's way more open than behind closed doors at a conference that's costs $1,000 to go to, or when it's in secretive DMs on Discord or whatever. And so it's just like, why not? Like take the take the plunge, so to speak. It can be helpful for sure.
I think it's very helpful to us who are in the industry, and I think it's actually very helpful to people who are on the outside of the industry.
Yeah.
Because before I got into the industry, I found it very helpful just being a part of the conversation, and understanding some of the do's and don'ts. So when you do get into the industry, you go, okay, I remember this story from 5 years ago. That may not seem like a big deal now, but we got to learn from our history, learn from our mistakes as an industry. And
Do you know what? It's kind of like cars, the car industry. A million years ago, cars did not have electric, up and down windows, right? And power windows. I don't know what it's called. But nowadays, that feature is standard. And it's just this ongoing stepping stone of things that were new and unique and you had to pay extra for eventually work their way into becoming standard. And it's the same with games. You have certain features like colorblind mode used to be a pretty unique thing, and even newsworthy. Oh, this game has added colorblind mode. And nowadays so many devs are adding it to their game that it's not newsworthy, which is a good thing, right? It means that it's become mass adopted, it becomes standard, and then people who are colorblind can just expect it to be there. And if it's not there, then that's like a legitimate concern because things become standardized.
yeah, it's becoming like to be expected rather than be the exception, right? So I think
Yeah.
that just like is nothing but beneficial.
Yeah.
So with your new role as a communications director at New World Interactive, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
So after over 10 years in the industry, what are a couple of the like smaller challenges that you've faced going into this new position? Doesn't have to be specific, of course, but just something that was like, because we've talked already that you said like when you're seeing certain conferences and certain talks that you're not taking as much away from it as you used to. So I wonder what it's like for you to go into a new role and kind of be hit with the challenge and be like, oh, this is a new one.
So I extremely lucked out in the timing of me arriving at New World Interactive for a few different reasons. They had just not too long ago been acquired by the Embracer Group, and sort of more directly, our parent is Saber Interactive. And so with that came a spirit of essentially doing a lot of corporate overhaul, if you want to call it that. There's a real push internally to do, like right before I started, the company redid the management, but also it involved the entire team. There was a big overhaul of our vision, purpose, and values of the studio. And a really cool thing that we're doing right now is we're essentially working on very super practical ways to seep that into the company culture and have them not just be writing on the wall, like a
Yeah.
stereotypical copy and paste it on the website. It's like, how do we actually create these into things that exist in real life and affect everybody on the day to day, which is I've never been in a company that's big enough to really put an emphasis on just straight up culture nurturing, if you want to call it that. So that's really cool. It's new. I have a ton of like management work that I'm doing that I've never really had the ability to do at this level, which is really cool because that's probably my favorite part about all of this is leading my little my little team. Um, so that's, I don't know, it's very rewarding and it's neat. It's funny because the comms part, after coming from Evolve, where you're launching games every every
Yeah.
few months, it's like
100%.
you're just churning all these games out. It's so with Evolve, you're really you're in the weeds, you're doing the stuff. And now I can finally take a step back and look at the games we're working on and say, okay, what's my 2-year plan for this? Which is
Must be
unheard
nice.
of
Yeah.
when you're on contracts and you don't have 2 years to deal with. And yeah, it's really, it's not even a challenge. It's just cool. It's a fun thing to be able to do, is to look at all of 2022. What am I going to do with Insurgency? And it's like, oh, that's cool.
Because you're not always in like review season and always in a launch window. Because I can imagine that being, yeah, it evolved that like just this
Yeah.
one's out the door. These three are all like the next slate, right? You don't see any like, you can
Yeah.
only
And
see
the
5
thing,
feet in front of you.
yeah, the thing with Evolve is you're on these contracts with your clients, but you're billing monthly. And so you're really just planning out each month, and that's it. And you do have big plans, and each of those months slot into it. But ultimately, you're really focused on each month specifically. And now I'm like, I don't even know what month it is half the time. It's just like, now that it's December, really, I'm planning out all of 2022. Fingers crossed that I can actually do that, but it's neat.
Must be good for like a big picture person like you that you can actually do that now and like you can kind of see into the future a little bit of your ideas.
Yeah, and we have a publisher focus, and they need to be involved with everything because, well, they're a publisher, but also they're really great at doing a lot of the publisher side roles. And so it's like, it's nice to be able to plan all this out ahead of time so that nobody's getting surprised and everyone can actually do the best work that they can because they know what's coming down the pipeline. And it's, yeah, it's nice.
So speaking of Insurgency, something that you're actually able to work like directly on now, which is great.
Mhm.
The FPS genre itself, I think oversaturated might be the best way to put it. I think there are some incredible ones, no question,
Mhm.
right? Like there's, and so many of them do things completely unique, just like Insurgency does. That it's like, I don't think there's anything wrong with having that many because then you find like people pick what they like and they have a lot more option to choose from.
Yeah.
From a comms perspective, what is it like working in that specific genre that has like all these juggernauts to not necessarily compete with, but at least be aware of and like work with and to
Yeah.
learn from?
Yeah, it's funny because on the one side, I'm super lucky in that, well, for two reasons. One is that Focus, our publisher, handles media and influencer
Oh
relations
wow.
for things like code, giving code distribution or whatever. My plans for next year are to build a content creator program for the studio, and so that will be Insurgency, but also all our games, and so it'll be a little bit different. Um, but then also, Insurgency Sandstorm has many years worth of fans already playing the game, and I happened to join the exact same month as the console release.
Yep.
And so like our our fan base grew substantially. And so on the one side, I haven't had to do the very, very difficult work of building a fan base from scratch, which is very nice. It's a great position to be in.
That's
That does
fair.
mean the community has its quirks, it has its preferences. So you don't have a ton of leeway in terms of trying new things or changing things. You do have to maintain some of the status quo with them to keep everybody sort of playing away happily or whatever. For sure, if you look at our Twitter mentions, we're a lot of players will compare us to games that are way, 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 way bigger in terms
Mhm.
of development budget, staff sizes, like getting compared to Battlefield and COD, where they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of staff compared to us, who we do not have that many staff at all. It's like two numbers instead of three. Um, it's really hard to live up to those expectations sometimes. For sure, we also do get compared to other more indie titles. Like
Mm.
we're not indie anymore, but it's we're still small comparatively. And so there are some titles that we get compared to which are in that same vein. But ultimately, the nice thing about Sandstorm is it stands on its own. It's gotten really solid media reviews. There's a slate of content creators who make content and who love it. And there's a dedicated fan base, which is, it's just an amazing place to be in. And then I think, honestly, if we spend next year focusing on goodwill and bringing new content and making the game better, it seems pretty straightforward to me. Fingers crossed.
I think it's also something that's pretty, I wouldn't necessarily use the word unique, but it's something that I think has become standardized in like FPS, is that the game launches, that's not an end of something. That is really a brand new beginning of anything, right? Is you have patches, you have content updates, you have like the console launch, supporting things to new platforms. So you're kind of able to keep it new. How is this different from other experiences that you've had? Like when it comes to keeping things fresh and keeping things new for people, and like kind of planning that out in your head of how you're going to make each one its own little spike.
Yeah, I mean, that is something I'm still learning for sure. I'm only on month 4, I guess.
Mhm.
I started in September, so someone do the math. Um, but yeah, I am learning how to balance between new and different and exciting versus stay with what people's expectations are.
Yeah.
I'm probably our team is going to be more experimental with our next game, Bracket S, rather than Insurgency,
Mhm.
because it is an established, like the first Insurgency was from 2014 and a source code mod, and like so that universe has existed for a really long time at this point. So there's just a set identity to it that we're not going to stray too far from, or we're not going to stray from the identity at all. It's like, what can you do within those limits, essentially?
What a good place to be in, though, is that you're able to kind of, you have this thing and it's working, and you're able to kind of put a certain amount of attention towards it, and then that in itself allows you to start to look to the future and look to like other new projects.
Yeah, and it's also just a great way to say, like, what's working here, what can we carry over? What's not working here, what can we change for this other thing? And it's really nice to be able to have those two different things going on.
One of the things that I did want to get into, that you and me had talked about before, and I think was one of the things that is very near and dear to both of our hearts, is like the video game industry is by far the biggest business in the world, right? Like when it comes to entertainment. So like, why do you think that still to this day it's so difficult for one, certain people to wrap their heads around it, and like explain working in video games is on the same level as a lot of other things when it comes to entertainment, considering how profitable and how big the industry is, but
Yeah.
also how many different disciplines it actually takes to be able to run the company. We've talked about comms and talked about PR and marketing, production, all of these things that when people think video games, they're thinking coding and they're thinking programming, but you can't really find those in school very often. Like I went for PR. I knew where I wanted to go. I knew where I wanted to be. Why do you think that it's taken this long, and it's still taking this long for people really to be able to go to school for PR in video games, or go to school for things like that?
Yeah. Yeah. This is like my endless crusade of whatever. I think so. There's a few things there. I think that creation wise, video games are essentially take every entertainment media and put them together. There's theatrics, there's cinematography and film and cutscenes and stuff. There's narrative and storytelling. There's voice work and like books and magazines. Like take every media and put it into one thing, and that's a video game, including live action performance at this point.
Oh yeah.
And so that's why, so they're so much more complex. And you look at a blockbuster film and a blockbuster video game, and the budgets are just like X number way larger for the game.
Oh yeah.
So there's that, plus all the technology. So it's like you take all the entertainment industries and all the tech industries and you put them together. That's video games. Very complicated. And yet, if you made a reality TV show about making video games or you do a behind the scenes documentary, it would be so boring. Like it's meetings and and it's not interesting at all to
Mythic
watch.
Quest is pretty good.
Well, yeah, there you go. But like, but that's dramatized, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
I think the film industry is well over 100 years old at this point. It's very established. They have pretty set protocols about certain things. Some of that was due to the unions. And so because of all and it's super interesting to watch from an outsider's perspective. So they've had things like behind the scenes and documentaries, and there's a ton of ways for even a layperson to get a bit of an understanding if they want to on how a movie is made. And you don't need to understand the crazy terminology, like no one knows what a key grip is or something like that. But I mean, I do because I have a cousin who is, but my point, but ultimately, you can watch a documentary about the making of movie X and it's captivating. It's just as compelling as watching that movie. You watch a documentary about the making of a video game and it's not necessarily as captivating. I will do a tiny little plug slash shout out to the editor of The Escapist, who his name is Nick, and he before he took over The Escapist, he was running a little channel called Gamementary. So he makes these really interesting, and there's no clip too. There's a few of these.
No, yeah,
like,
no clip's always my go-to when people ask me those questions. I'm like, no clip is like my top tier.
Yeah, and so there are some of these that can be really, really great, but there's not very many, and they don't have mass adoption by the the audience is that large.
Agreed.
And so the understanding of what goes into making a game, nobody knows. And if you ask a PC console developer how to make a mobile game, they're not going to know. If you ask anybody how to make esports anything, nobody's going to like. It's so huge. It's so segmented. There's highly specialized knowledge. Plus, everyone is bonkers level secret about everything all the time. It results in this sort of concoction of just nobody understands anything at all in the industry, out of the industry. And that means that players don't necessarily understand how games are made, but it also means that schools don't necessarily know how to teach to that or make curriculums for it unless they happen to have a dean from the industry who's like leading their own personal crusade for that specific thing, which does happen here and there, but ultimately it's really hard to show how they would build this course content. I've been in some of those conversations with universities and colleges, and most of them will just say business stuff, which is a bit of accounting and a bit of like legal how
kind of a catch-all,
all of marketing in one day. And like there's a million different business non-development related tasks that just gets lumped into one thing together, which is strange, not really appropriate, but that's fine. So there's like all of that. This is super rambling. But on top of all of those things, especially in Canada, a lot of these jobs don't exist because primarily, so in Quebec, especially, a lot of the industry started on the AAA side where these big studios come in from other countries and they put their development hubs here. So 95% of the staff are coders and artists and technical artists and people in that sphere, producers, and you don't necessarily have people doing the marketing or the legal work or anything like that. So that's an issue. Indies don't have those kinds of positions, so schools aren't going to teach for that. it's hard to identify exactly why schools don't teach for these positions because they do exist. Is it a numbers thing? Is it because they don't understand? I don't know. I have no idea actually. I would love to know why.
With the video game industry being so young, like comparatively to like film and music and things like that, do you see like a future in 20 years where someone's able to go to university for community management in the video game
Oh,
industry?
yeah. Yeah, yeah. Like there are schools right now who are having those discussions. And so presumably at some point these classes will exist, especially as many colleges move more towards job focused education rather than high arts. Let's study philosophy for which I'm not bashing at all because that's what I did. But it's a different philosophy to higher education, job focus versus like personal growth focus. So a lot of institutions are moving towards job placements and having internships and co-ops wrapped into the programs. And I think that will help bring those programs about. Ultimately, it probably comes down to numbers. I'm guessing, I'm totally guessing here, but I'm guessing they need to show there are X number of positions that open up every year in the industry.
Mm.
So we are able to graduate Y number of students every year in that profession. And there's, I'm hoping, some kind of magical math that the schools are doing so that these people have jobs to go to. I don't know. I have no idea how all this works out, but the conversations are happening and people are trying to figure out how to get a broader range of curricula developed.
They're saying that like obviously with most industries, a lot of the jobs that are quote unquote available aren't necessarily on the open market, right? Like I think especially with video games being such like a network heavy thing, like we've previously discussed, do you think that that actually shows like less video game jobs are actually end up on the market, but there are even more that have been open? They just kind of get filled through these conversations, or do you think that that's just kind of like business in general?
Honestly, I have no idea. I know that I know there are companies. Here are the things that I know, and let's see if we can piece it together. So I know for sure there are a lot of job postings out there, or some anyway, that will say, like, we're hiring for this position when that's not actually the case. It's a place for people to drop resumes into, and then
They're
the
like, you're qualified
recruiting
for this. Yeah.
staff will only cherry pick the people who seem good enough by whatever standard they're measuring by. Um, there's also just the fact that it's a global industry in nature. A lot of people relocate from various places to go specifically for jobs. And yet, a lot of those relocation deals require visas and
Mm.
certificates of graduation from places. And it's especially challenging for if someone can't afford to relocate, either family reasons or financially or whatever. So it's like it's it's hard to balance that jobs exist, globally speaking,
Mm.
and people are not as flexible as those jobs necessarily are. I think a lot of remote working has helped,
Mm.
probably. That's a challenge. It really is a big challenge. And like for us, for example, we have a ton of positions open, and it's less because of we're not even only hiring seniors. We have a bunch of entry level positions as well. But it's connecting the dots between who's looking at any given time
Yeah.
versus are they available to work in our jurisdiction, which is mostly Canada. We have some Americans. Um, it's yeah, it's complicated, I think.
What do you think are some of the like most underrated transferable skills? So like we've talked about like how there's not a lot of places that are teaching these things specifically. Like what do you think are some of the ones that like you see that just because of your experience in the industry that you're like, oh, they maybe they haven't worked in this exact position somewhere else before, but based on something that they've learned somewhere else, they would be a great fit for role X.
Yeah, I mean, so community is a good example. I think people can come from just about any discipline where you're able to plan and discuss and have a bit of a thick skin sometimes, and like be compassionate yet also impartial.
Mm-hmm.
Like community, anything in communications is quite soft skill focused.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can come from all over the place and come into these roles. Something like accounting and legal, well, legal, you need to know entertainment law for sure. Accounting, it would be good to know entertainment accounting because there's weird things like bridge financing and things that are specific to entertainment sectors, including television and film. But ultimately, there's a ton of it is transferable. I will say the opposite happens. I talked to a recruiter once who was recruiting for non games industry related things and pretty much just poaches people right out of the industry because usually they're higher paying jobs.
Yep.
They have like very often they have a better work-life balance, and very often the skill set required in games is higher than other industries. So this conversation was about community managers who essentially what this guy was telling me was you take a community manager in games and they are like way far and beyond the skill level of a community manager who's in some other like a normie industry, and they just like you have to be so ahead of the curve and on it and responsive and proactive and
Yeah.
all of these different things that a lot of other industries are super happy to take a games worker, which I'm not advocating for this at all,
Yeah.
but it is a thing
Stay.
that happens.
Yeah.
Like I think a lot of programmers probably burn out and go work in. It's probably really simple to make a banking app or something compared to a very complicated sim physics based video game, right? And so it's like for some people they likely just move industries because it's a better option for them personally. But then the flip side is there's a ton of opportunity in games for people who don't think of themselves as gamers or
Mm-hmm.
creative types. Like I'm not an artist. I am very creative in terms of my marketing and communications sort of strategies. There's a lot of space for creativity, even if it's not art or whatever, design, you know?
That's a I never thought about it going the other way. I don't know why. Maybe that's just on me, but like you know how talented people are in the industry. Like that there's never a doubt about that. And you
Yeah.
always think of like people trying to break into the industry, but I guess yeah, like why wouldn't you if you were on that side of the aisle, why wouldn't you look to the games industry and say, "Wow, like they've literally like forged in flames like to be able to do some of the things that they're able to do and the kind of
Yeah.
turnover and the type of just the industry itself, what it kind of lends to is contract work and a deadline and like constantly switching jobs and switching positions just based on like game cycles and things like that. Like a lot of companies hire up and then they trim back down after a big release and like things like that. But I think I can see looking towards that stability and like that becoming more and more attractive as you go in the industry longer.
Yeah, but you know what? I think that's all changing too.
It is,
Like
I agree.
part of the reason why I came to New World was the philosophy of the studio is essentially we're hiring staff to be staff. And it
Hmm.
doesn't matter if we're ramping up or down on a game, you're being hired to work at the studio and it's not related to development cycles or anything like that. And which I think is a good thing. And also just
100%.
career progression and actually allowing people on staff to understand I have this title right now, but this is where I can be at the studio if I want to work towards a different position. And that's also something that I don't see at a ton of studios who I've talked to or worked with. It's like this, and I think that's all, across the industry, studios like ours taking steps in those directions, it'll create change over time. It's not huge, it's not radical, but it is like one at a time. All these studios will start to face pressures on hiring and retention, and so we adapt and we change and we make life for all of us better incrementally, one step at a time.
I think that's one of the things with being like we've said a few times already, of like being a young industry, where it's like there are going to be a lot of growing pains and things to like kind of figure out as we go. We are definitely leaps and bounds ahead of certain industries in certain things, and we are definitely the exact opposite in other things, and like that kind of needs to balance out a little bit more. Well, I think that'll probably about do it for episode 4 of the Lodgge podcast. I would love to thank my wonderful guest Astrid for joining us today. This is brought to you by Interactive Ontario and with help from Ontario Creates. Astrid, thank you again for joining us. It was lovely to have you. Hopefully, if you guys have these 2022 plans and anything else you want to talk about, please come back, join us, tell some of the great stories. Everybody go check Astrid out on Twitter. Twitter is the way to go to get a hold of most of us.
I am in the Interactive Ontario Discord server.
Join the Discord. Anyone that is with Interactive Ontario yet, come join the Discord. And thank you guys again, and we'll see you soon. Take care.